what does Pan-Africanism mean to you?
I mean, I knew about Pan-Africanism because I knew about the role that my great-grandfather played in helping to found the Organization for African Unity, but also the university. I remember my father talking about scholarships that they had for African students at the AA University, at the Addis Ababa University. So to me, it always meant African and people of African descent in the diaspora. It meant identity, it meant unity, and it meant knowledge. To me, it means brotherhood and identity and pride.
All right, you guys, let's get into first.
There is a movement promoting our stories, and many of us grew up with a strong craving for images we can relate to. Production teams, writers, creative heads have come together to tell stories, and this podcast is their voice. The themes covered are very relevant to the Black community, and anyone concerned by the social and racial injustices that are in place to stifle this voice. The Pan-African voice is not easily heard, and here we talk about our movies, that film or doc which you heard about but didn't get to see. What was the story? Where can I watch it? It now has a voice. Tune in. We walk you through these stories and interview the filmmakers. Welcome. Karibu sana. Karibu sana.
And starting right on the lens. Ready, and action.
Thanks again for joining the Pan-African Film Podcast. Today, we have Constance Marks, Corinne Lepouk. Am I pronouncing it right?
Corinne Lepouk, close enough.
Yeah. Okay, Corinne Lepouk, and the film subject Yeshi Kassa, joining us to discuss the documentary film Grandpa Was an Emperor. So Grandpa Was an Emperor won several awards over the past couple of years, including the 2022 Pan-African Film Festival Documentary Award. And it traces Yeshi Kassa's journey to uncover her family's history. As the great-granddaughter of Haile Selassie, the last emperor of Ethiopia, she looks for answers to how her family survived the 1974 coup, at what cost, and really what happened to those who didn't survive. I would say the main themes are, history, revolution, royalty, family, and even I guess on a deeper level or scale, there's a lot in there about truth and reconciliation, maybe at another kind of level to it, but definitely a lot of information, as I was saying earlier, where I personally had to watch it at least twice just to absorb how much was condensed into just an hour and a half or so of the feature documentary. So without too much rambling on, because I could talk forever about this documentary, I want to introduce and welcome the producers first, Constance Marks, Corinne Lepouk, and the film subject to tell us a little bit more about your careers, your background. And I'm really curious to hear, how did you all meet up and decide to work together on this project?
So, do you want me to start with how we met up, or what would you like me to start with?
Tell us a little bit about yourself. And I know this is not your first documentary, and you also directed the film, is that right?
I did. So I've been a documentary filmmaker one way or another since basically I got out of college, which was a long time ago. And I got a grant to make a film for the humanities when I was 21, and made a film in rural West Virginia, and really didn't have any filmmaking skills at the time. I was lucky to get this grant based on another film I had made, but I really wasn't an experienced filmmaker. So I hired people who knew what they were doing, and they taught me the rudimentary steps of filmmaking. And one of the things I was very lucky to do was to work with an editor named Deborah Dixon, who worked at Maysles Films. David and Albert Maysles are kind of pioneer cinema verite filmmakers. And so we were cutting that Appalachian film in a rented cutting room in their offices. And when that job was done, I was very lucky that they asked me if I wanted to be an assistant editor in their shop. And so I started, that's really how I started, was properly learning from that job. And that went on for years. I was an assistant editor for them, and then I did a little producing for them. And the way I met Yeshi, fast forward, like 35 years or something like that, was we were both doing philanthropic, was that the right word, Yesh? We were both volunteering for the annual homeless count in New York. So hundreds of people volunteer, and you're broken into groups of 5 or 6 people. And I was extremely fortunate that Yeshi Kassa we were assigned to the same group. And that's how we met, that very cold winter night, starting at midnight, walking the streets of New York, asking people if they had a place to stay that night. And that's where our friendship began. And she told me a little bit about where she was from, though I didn't have any idea of the story. And we decided to meet after that night and for a cup of tea. And she told me her family story. And she had said, the family's thinking we either want to write a book or we want to make a film about what happened to our family. And I said, do you know what I do? And she said, no, what do you do? And I said, I'm a documentary filmmaker. And anytime you ever want to talk about it or bad ideas around, I'm here to help. I'm very soft sell, Anna, very soft sell. But wow. I think 6 months later, they had seen some of the work that Corinne and I have done. And I think we'll go more into detail about this, but the family asked if we would help them tell their story, and how lucky we were that happened.
Oh, New York Winter Tale, definitely amazing in itself.
And that was in 2015.
Okay.
There's a scene in the film where we go back and we do it another year. Do you remember? Yes, she's talking to Hot Wheels. Hot Wheels is the name he gave us, in the subway. And I was just like shooting with, I think, my phone. Right? But we did it a few more times together, and I just casually would shoot.
And I did want to add to that. I mean, when we met on that cold New York night, it was the Hope Count. And I had just moved back from Ethiopia to the US with the intent of either doing a book or a film about my family. Okay. And all my friends had left New York. Anna, you lived in New York. You know how that can be. And I remember that night, I think I'm a very good judge of character. And I just knew we were going to be friends. And I said to Connie, I've lost all my friends in New York. Will you be my friend? And that's really how we started. It was a friendship from day one. And then I found out that she was a filmmaker, and she introduced me to Corinne.
It's so serendipitous.
When's the last time somebody asked you, will you be my friend? I think second grade was the last time that had happened. And it was such a joy to hear those words come out of an adult. It was just so beautiful. And I said to her, I wish I'd asked you first.
Oh, that's so sweet. Yeah. And Corinne, to hear a little more from you, what's your background, and have you worked with Constance before?
Yes, most of my career has been working in entertainment, but on the other side of the camera, not producing, more administrative or organizing things. I worked for the original team at MTV back in the 80s, doing programming for that when nobody knew what MTV was. I worked at CBS in advertising. I ran the New York office of the American Film Institute for a bunch of years. And then I actually took time off to raise my sons. And Connie and I were in film class in 8th grade together. So we go way back. And she called me and asked me if I would be interested in producing with her. And I was, and that film was the documentary Being Elmo. So that was the first time we worked together. And that was, I think, about 15 years ago.
Wow, that's awesome.
I was born in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Here we go. The emperor is my great-grandfather. But we didn't think of him as the emperor. To us, he was just grandpa. My mommy, I don't think she wanted to be a princess. It was duty more than choice.
The stature of the emperor on a global scale was incredible.
Your Majesty, you're most welcome.
So yeah, one of the first questions I had was about how long the entire process took. And you said you initially started having this conversation in 2015. Is that right? Okay, so a good, 6-7 years from inception?
there were fits and starts because of COVID. We suddenly had to stop because nobody knew how to have everybody in the same room together to, mix the film, to color correct the film. So all that went on hold for like a year almost.
Okay.
We figured it out, but we weren't able to complete it remotely. And then with one final meeting in person to sign off on it. So it slowed things down about a year, I would say.
And Yeshi, how important was it for you to capture like your family's perspective of the revolution and all those critical events which brought about so much change to Ethiopia? And also like how much of it was just a search for accountability for what truly transpired, but perhaps was never exposed?
It became important to me in my later years. I was the person in my family who didn't want to know about the revolution. I'd never gone back to Ethiopia. It was just the whole thing was just very, very difficult for me. And then I lived in Ethiopia. I moved and lived in Ethiopia. And I had this awful realization that people from that regime, from the Derg regime, were writing books and being interviewed, and they never talked about what had happened to the 60 of my relatives, and also what had happened to the imperial women. And I really did wait for a long time because there are people who are better qualified than I am to tell this story in my family. But as time passed, lots of senior people in our family passed away, as you saw me say in the film. And it just hit me that, in a limited way, I needed to tell the story of at least my mother and father. Because, if you try and tell the whole story, it's intimidating because it's about Emperor Haile Selassie, and there are historians and senior members of the family who would be better. But the fact that Derg officials never talked about it and never acknowledged what they did to these women, a lot of whom were older, that was a big driving force for me. And then it became important to do it because so many people passed away. And then I think that was also what encouraged my mother to do it. The fact that we needed to record our side of the history and what had happened to our family. I think the accountability and searching for that and finding out about it before I made the film, I think people who talked to me about that time were either very extremely against the imperial family or very for the imperial family. There was no middle ground. And one of the journeys for me in the film was talking to people like Professor Shimeldis and Professor Mesfin, who and Dr. Jacob, people who really were a part of that time and understood what had happened. So once they more clearly explained it to me, then I was interested in finding out really, it's hard to say, that it made me realize that, of course, my great-grandfather as the emperor had ultimate responsibility. And it was a logical way for me to get to that conclusion, whereas before it was always like filled with emotion either side. So I think it was important in the end to, I'm just so thankful I got to make the film when the people who I interviewed were still alive. My mom is no longer with us. My mom passed away. My aunt Sophie passed away from the film. Mama Zuriash, like a lot of people. So I'm grateful that I came to that realization and the need to do it in enough time to have been able to speak to those people.
That is amazing, and sorry to hear of your loss, but that's interesting. So basically, as you got into the project, that's when some of the pieces started fitting together for you. Yes. That's so amazing.
Yes, and I think it started. I never wanted to know what Ethiopia as a country had gone through. I'd never been to the Martyrs Museum. I hadn't looked at that aspect of it. And that was also something that, because of the film, I really did. It made me realize that Ethiopia as a country had gone through so much, and it was clear for me to see it. at the museum and talking to historians and lawyers and stuff.
I really feel that Yeshi was the perfect person to walk us through this story. And I had a sense of that from the get-go. I'm very lucky that if I was going to meet anybody in the family, that I met Yeshi, because, as you know, she was out of the country when this happened. And so she had all these unanswered questions. She really is like us in the audience, you know, the person who doesn't maybe know this history as well as the people who were there. So with all due respect to Yeshi demurring and saying there are other people more qualified, I think from a filmmaking point of view, Yeshi was the perfect guide for us to take us by the hand, and brave at that for, you know, revealing her story and being so open.
Right. And that kind of segues into what I was going to ask you both, Constance and Corinne, like what fascinated you about the story to embark on the journey. You know, it's one thing to kind of help a friend unravel their personal life, but was it that you were really going to unpack such a big topic, but through the eyes of somebody who was close to you, and also be, as you said, like almost like somebody watching from the outside and more relatable to you? And then also I wanted to know, like, what were your biggest challenges, right? It's quite a big project.
I'll go first with what drew me to it, and then you, Corinne, you want to do that after? Sure. So, I mean, Yeshi drew me to it. I met Yeshi that night, and she was just so funny and smart and kind. And when we came upon a man who was seriously, I mean, he would have frozen in the doorway if he hadn't been brought inside. He was clearly homeless, wrapped in garbage bags with twine. And most of the people in the group kind of backed away. Yeshi was fearless. She just went right in. She took him by the hand. She gave him her mittens. She was talking to him. And I was just blown away by this very caring, very compassionate individual. I didn't know that Yeshi's story paralleled this man's story, in that he was in a place that was not his home. He wanted to go home, and he was trapped here and away from his family. And, you know, it was just so clear to me watching Yesh that night, and just, there was a lot of laughing too, and at other points in the evening. And I just was really drawn to her personality. And then when I heard this story, I had been in Ethiopia the summer before the revolution, and just had no clue whatsoever. You know, we were like basically in Addis, using that as a jumping off point. So I had some kind of an attachment to the place and was really curious what happened. Did I know that the story would be this big? I mean, I heard Yeshi tell me the story that day when we had tea, but I couldn't imagine taking on something. I didn't imagine it would be that large, and it turned out to be that large and more, right, Yesh? But we just kind of, you know, traveled, Corinne included, traveled down that road together. And the story just kept opening up and opening up and opening up. And then there were all these off ramps that we had to explore, many of which, you know, ended up being cul-de-sacs, but turn around, go back. But many, you know, it's a big story, many of which did not. We called it the octopus. So Yeshi is what drew me to the story. No questions asked. I remember calling Corinne and telling her I met this incredible woman, and we were developing other ideas for films, and I thought I was going to get pushback. And she was like, that sounds fantastic. So,
yeah, well, I would echo everything Connie said about Yeshi, because we got together for lunch. And from the minute I met her, I was just thought, this is a remarkable person, and I'd love to spend time with her and get to know more about her life. And I think the more I learned about it, the more fascinated I became. I knew who Haile Selassie was. I knew a little bit about him, but I certainly didn't know all the things that we were going to learn. And then when I met Princess Sebla and the rest of her family, I just was so, you know, honored to be able to help them tell their story. And as Connie said, it became more and more complicated. Every time we did an interview would be like, what? Like, we didn't hear about the Bob Marley aspect until later. We didn't know, right, to tell this part, that when Connie was interviewing Yeshi, one of the later interviews after many years, she said something about her siblings' rescue and their escape, and that she said, oh, Bob paid for the planes. We had no idea that had happened. She just casually dropped that. So it was just a real adventure and learning so much about history and wondering why we've never were taught any of this history when we were growing up, and just getting to know her amazing family.
I remember Connie saying to me, I was in Ethiopia in that summer, and I was just astounded, because it was for me, it was such a dark time, and we're pretty much the same age, Connie and I. So, it was interesting. She brought a picture of her mom outside the big cathedral in Ethiopia. I think that's when I really believed you. And we used it as a calling card when we would go and visit people. I'm like, she's been to Ethiopia. She was here. So, but, one of the things that was interesting to me was like, we're much the same age. And, Connie came back to America, and I went to England, and then the revolution happened, and really neither of us had any idea. So, but it was also, for me, you guys have to talk about the challenges, but one of the biggest challenges, but for me, was, would my mother and my family be comfortable telling their story? And, many people had approached my mother before, and I think it really was it was just a blessing, because it all came together at one time. My mom realized she was pretty much the last daughter of Princess Tananye. And I met Connie and Corinne, and I brought them down. And my siblings, I actually didn't ask them if they were ready to tell their story. I think they wanted to help. But it was my mother, and the fact that she felt so comfortable with Connie and Corinne. Otherwise, it would never have happened. And that, I think, was what made the difference for all of us. That was the biggest thing for us to overcome. And she was brave from, I think it was like the first time that you guys came down, right? Do you remember?
We came down to film, and Princess Sebla respectfully said, I support this film, but I want to be off camera, but I will support it in any way that I can. But I don't want to be interviewed. Yeah, she said, what do we do? I said, we'll find a way. We'll figure it out. And I guess your mom heard us and observed us working. And I think either later that day, once we got back to New York, we got a call, and it's kind of like, my mom would be okay being interviewed by you, like next Thursday for half an hour. And that led to like a 4-hour interview. And then we got a call that night. My mom didn't really get to say everything she wanted to say. Can there be another interview? And so we ended up having a lot of interviews with the family. And everybody in the family was incredible in their first interview. There's footage in the film from everybody's first interview.
What was really interesting to me was that it seemed like the family didn't ever discuss the events, even with each other. So I remember the first interview with Yeshi and Jote, and Jote said, I didn't know that. Like, they were just going back and forth, telling each other things that they had never spoken, even amongst themselves. So that was really fascinating.
Also, behind the scenes, Corinne can tell you that when I was interviewing family members, often off camera, the rest of the family would be listening. And they would be reduced to tears learning what their loved ones, I know Yeshi did a lot, hearing what happened to her sisters. She would just be, very emotional. And it was hard. It was hard learning it all. Challenges, I just always come back to the same one, and everybody kind of rolls their eyes. But finding the right editor was the hardest challenge, because this film it needed like a veteran genius, so and Bob Eisenhart is that. He is just, just like the top of the A team. So for me, that was the most challenging filmmaking issue. I would also say personally, pushing Yeshi to have to do things that were so painful was unpleasant and challenging for everybody involved. And Yeshi understood, and there were things she knew she wanted to do but didn't want to do, and I was in the position that, maybe we should push for this. So that was challenging. You've unearthed stuff that you have not wanted to look at your entire life.
It's like, this is your frigging punishment, Yeshi Kassa, for ignoring it for decades and decades and decades.
Time will pass and we'll forget all the details and how it happened. It's very easily forgotten.
I It sounds like some doors were kind of naturally opening up, but others you kind of had to push open and were harder to. I definitely, like, in the Pan-African Film podcast, actually, we've interviewed other people who just talked a lot about just not just in Ethiopia, across the continent, how just culturally we don't naturally talk about things or painful things. Even out here with African Americans, it's kind of like passing on the pain in a way that's come up a lot of times. And so like it's avoided. So I can definitely relate to that. In fact, I noticed in your credits that you worked with a previous interviewee. We had Tamara Dawit. I think that was on the local footage and archives. And, not just like as a personal thing, do we not talk about things, but I know that much of the royal family's history has been manipulated or even erased from the media. And it's not just something of the past, it's something that goes on now. I think it was very, very illuminating for me to watch, like how, I guess the media in itself was quite new at the time and just how little control they had back then of what was said. But how difficult was it for you all to access and source those archived images and the footage?
It was important that we were able to find those because back in the day, it was really dangerous for people in Ethiopia to have images of the royal family after the coup, and there could be grave consequences for that. So a lot of the pictures were destroyed. Fortunately, some people had some, and they, from time to time will mail them to the family. And Yeshi's mother, Princess Sebla, actually took a lot of home videos that we were able to use, which was excellent. We used a lot of the archival houses, and Tamara was wonderful being in Addis, helping us get some of the materials from there. But we were able to get, I think, very good archival materials. I think the most exciting for me was the Blue Peter footage of Yeshi's father when he went on to talk about trying to get help for the famine, because Yeshi's brother Amaha had never heard his father's voice before. And the family said that they thought that he had been on the show called Blue Peter on the BBC. So we were able to track that down. And you saw in the film showing it to the family, and that was really rewarding. But there were a lot of really excellent pieces of archival that we were able to find.
Yeah, for sure. I think when you mentioned the editing, it was in the end very well put together. And congratulations, even on the directing, like the way you unfolded the story was really good to watch. And because you didn't reveal everything like right at the beginning, right? It was like a slow reveal. So it was really, it was captivating. So congratulations on that. And also congratulations on, like I saw Cynthia Erivo was credited as executive producer on the project. Like, how did that involvement come about? And why was she so supportive of your story?
Corinne, I think you should take this one.
We were able to get a copy of the film to Salome Williams, who is Cynthia's partner in their company, Edith's Daughter Productions, which is named after Cynthia's mom. And she was very moved by the film. And she sent it to Cynthia, who also was very taken with it and the story, and Yeshi in particular. And they came on board as executive producers, which was incredible for us because, to be honest with you, it's not easy, as you know, to get interest in this story such as this right now when, the mainstream media doesn't cover a lot of things that you wish they would. And we really needed someone to champion the film, and they have been incredible champions of the film. I mean, really, they're not just name executive producers. They've been very, very involved in working with us to get the film out there. And through them, we were able to get represented by UTA. And then the film was sold to Byron Allen's company, Freestyle Digital Media, in the US and North America. So now we're focused on
and the Caribbean.
In the Caribbean, but it hasn't come out in the Caribbean yet. But we're focused on international next. But the thing about Edith's Daughter is that their mission is to focus on stories and people who are often overlooked and underrepresented. So they really are doing what they set out to do in getting Yeshi's story out there.
It was just amazing. I remember when Connie and Corinne told me that Cynthia was interested in Salome's Ethiopian, Salome Williams. And then when I heard the mission for Edith's Daughter, it was just like the perfect people to be executive producers for us. Like this film, every step of the way, Connie and Corinne have just found like the best champions for the film, starting with Bob Eisenhart. I didn't know anything about films, but once I knew that he was the editor, and Cynthia Salome, it's just been a blessed film. We've just had the most amazing champions on it. The musical score, everything was just like came together in such an amazing way. We're so grateful.
We had been cutting, editing to, music, scratch track that has to be replaced because you couldn't afford it, And what we were actually using was season 1 and 2 from The Crown. Oh. And when it came time to pulling it out and putting in music by our contemporaries or from music libraries or whatever, they just sounded so anemic and pale, and it just wasn't working. So I just thought, I'm going to just write to the guy who wrote the music for The Crown, the first 2 seasons, Rupert Gregson-Williams. And I wrote to Rupert, and I got an immediate reply saying, I explained to him that Bob was cutting the film. He had just cut Free Solo, which won the Academy Award. And, we have the great cameraman, Barney Broomfield. And, I kind of listed, the films that we had done in the past. And he wrote back and he said, I've been scoring Hollywood superhero movies for 2 years, and I'd love to use a different part of my brain. And he just made it happen. And it was one of the greatest gifts because the score of the film is something we're all really proud of. And I think it really elevates the film to a whole new level.
It totally does.
And also approaching, the people who owned Bob's music that we wanted to use. I mean, they agreed. We thought it would just take forever just because it's complicated and there's multiple, people that you have to get approval from. But I think they agreed within a week or something. And the same with Teddy Afro. Like, truly everybody wanted to be a part of this film. And for me, you can imagine it was a blessing because we were able to use everything in the film. So it was amazing. I remember just being stunned when we got the music, Bob's music and Teddy's. So, yeah.
That is amazing. It sounds like sometimes taking the first step is the hardest, right? And then things can come together. That's what your documentary sounds like. But just to come back to what you were saying in the story, Yeshi, you describe your perspective of the events, obviously, and it's more from a more global standpoint. And in particular, what you were talking about, your relationship with Bob Marley and that fascinating impact it had on your family's survival. There is a question we like to ask on the podcast, which is, what does Pan-Africanism mean to you? And I just want to hear it, obviously from Yeshi, but all of you really just understand.
I go first on this one. I mean, I knew about Pan-Africanism because I knew about the role that my great-grandfather played in helping to found the Organization for African Unity, but also the university. I remember my father talking about scholarships that they had for African students at the AA University, at the Addis Ababa University. And there were, at all times, there was a big African contingent there, as well as an Ethiopian contingent. So to me, it always meant African and people of African descent in the diaspora. It meant identity, it meant unity, and it meant knowledge. Ethiopia we've been blessed because we were never colonized. We were always taught about our history, but Ethiopia as a country, we were always cognizant of other colonized countries in Africa. My grandfather always spoke strongly against that and also against apartheid. So to me, it means brotherhood and identity and pride.
Yeah, Haile Selassie was definitely one of the founding fathers of Pan-Africanism. So it's great to hear that it's still important to you. And yeah, even recently I went to Ethiopia briefly, and there's still a difference compared to other countries. Like I was actually grew up mostly in Kenya, but the way that even when you land at the airport, it's all about Pan-Africanism and the African Union and all of that is still kind of really advocated as part of what the country stands for in itself. So that's good to hear. Were you able to travel to Ethiopia for the filmmaking part of the project? And what impact did it have on you as producers? Did you go to film in Ethiopia?
Yes, many times.
Yeah.
Several times, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And did you get that impression as well in terms of Pan-Africanism?
Well, there's a specific instance that comes to mind is when that beautiful statue of Haile Selassie was unveiled, and that was at the AU. And the president was there, and all kinds of dignitaries were there, and it was a world summit at the AU, and they used that as an opportunity to unveil the statue of Haile Selassie after all these years, which was very moving, very, very moving. But you can't help but understand that it was because of this Yeshi's great-grandfather that the AU was in Addis, in Ethiopia at all. So yeah, it's almost like tangible. You can feel it, especially at a gathering such as
that. And it hurt. I mean, there had been a time when nothing that my grandfather did was acknowledged. So there really was a long time where there was a debate about whether he was a founding father of the AU, and that really did sting. That's why I was so thankful and proud when his statue did go up, because he was literally like, he was the first president. There's a reason why the AU is in Ethiopia. And I remember our relatives who were in the foreign ministry telling us about how he really worked to bring all the different factions together, because there were different schools of thought about what African unity was at the time. And I remember a relative of ours was in the foreign ministry, and he said, Grandpa literally stood there for 12 hours making sure that he greeted every single delegate who came. And, to me, that was decades before the European Union, right? Which is the closest thing that you can compare it to. So for me, I was incredibly happy and proud when the AU acknowledged Grandpa's role and put his statue up. And also I remember my mother, telling us when she came on a state visit with Grandpa to the US, she said that particular visit, he really made sure to go to African-American areas. They went up to Harlem. The only interview he gave was for Jet. He got his honorary doctorate from Howard. And that was in acknowledgement of the support that African Americans had given to Ethiopia during, the war with Italy. So he was always very, very cognizant of the global African diaspora, not just in Africa, and made sure to acknowledge that.
But I wouldn't take it to heart in terms of like the criticism received for it. I think if you look at it on the global scale, all Pan-Africanists, I feel like the more you do for Pan-Africanism, you're just going to face challenges and criticism, especially when you actually make a real impact. I think it's just like, I just expect it. Rather than surprised by it now, I feel it's such a controversial thing, but I think it's made controversial, really, because it shouldn't be. And that's just my personal perspective. I don't know if that's how you feel, Yeshi. I guess we have similarities having lived in the UK and then the States. And, I just feel like sometimes you get lost in the locality of the issues.
Yeah.
And that benefits more people than you having, or like you said, a brotherhood and a different perspective. So I think, for me, I just come to expect the criticism. And I feel like the more impactful you are, the stronger it's going to come at you, right? So take it almost as a compliment, right?
It's an incentive.
It's a compliment that so many people are going to, criticize or have something negative to say when you do something so big like what Haile Selassie achieved. Even if you look at Mandela's achievements, where the ANC is now, it's like so much criticism around the party that he founded. But yeah, that moment of his statue going up is such a nice, it's a good feeling, right? And I'm so glad that this documentary allowed you to capture these good moments, especially before the losses and everything. And the timing seemed so perfect, right? To come together
We didn't know it about the statue, right? We suddenly found out about it. There wasn't any like real dialogue before then. And suddenly it was like, this is going to happen. And we went rushing to Ethiopia, do you remember, to film it? So yeah, it was amazing.
That's great. I also wanted to touch on like what advice you have for our listeners, like to other filmmakers working on a documentary, and more specifically for you, Yeshi, like what's your advice to those who want to uncover or tell, personal stories?
Absolutely do it. You were so right, Anna, about culturally, we don't talk about the good or the bad things. It's always hidden. You don't want to inflict your pain on other people. But one of the most gratifying things to me about this film was the number of people who come up to us after screenings or reach out on Facebook or Instagram and say, we had never talked about it as a family. My father had never told us what he had gone through, or I had never told my children. And the interest is from literally teenagers, 15-year-olds, all the way to people who are 80. And that to me was an unexpected, real bonus. The fact that the film was able to encourage people to talk about what their experiences were. And not just Ethiopians in Ethiopia. I had a friend, a Jewish friend, who said, we always tried to get my mother to talk about her experiences during the Holocaust, and she never did. And I wish I had been able to talk to her like you were able to talk to your mother. So for me, it's absolutely do it. Mommy was able to see the film in January and COVID hit in March and she got sick. So we just squeaked in, under the bar and absolutely. I don't know about you guys, but that's been the most gratifying thing to me about this film, just the conversations.
I agree. We showed the film at the AFI Theater in Silver Spring, Maryland, and it was sold out a couple of screenings, but people just were mobbing Yeshi, wanting to talk to her afterward. And they came up to Connie and me and thanked us. And I remember someone in particular saying, I'm going to go home right now and talk to my family about what I've gone through. And that they just had never done it before. So it almost like gave them permission and encouraged them to share their stories, which is just a wonderful thing to happen from the film.
Did you want to add anything, Constance?
Well, I echo what Yeshi and Corinne have just said exactly. We lose people and people hold history. And it's very easy to do nothing. Even with our own relatives, Corinne is always saying to me, let's film your mom. Let's just get it down. My mom's going to be 93 in August. And we did that for her dad, just for family consumption, not to make a big fancy thing. But I think it's really important to memorialize memories in the history that our elders carry. And so I agree with Yeshi.
We lost, I would say, Yeshi Khan, about 7 to 10 people that we interviewed passed away.
Yeah, people on camera.
Yeah.
A lot of people have died.
And find you wonderful, wonderful people like Connie and Corinne to do it. I told you I was a good judge of character.
Yes, you were. Yeah. And I think, obviously I know through my children, like they read so much less and less nowadays that using film as the medium is so much more impactful as well, isn't it? Like you said, it doesn't have to be written as a book or just take a quick video and do a quick interview, even if it's just your grandmother or personally, just because it's more likely that the next generation are going to look through that than papers or books nowadays, isn't it? So thank you for taking those steps. Thank you for all the energy and the love you put into the project. It was so beautiful to watch. And just to wrap up the podcast, I wanted to ask you if you have any personal fun facts or your social media pages, if you want to share with the audience. We do have a big audience on the continent, but also out here, and just let them know where they can find the film for now and any websites you want to share.
We are on Instagram and Facebook at Grandpa Was an Emperor, and we are on Twitter at Grandpa Film. The film was released a little over a month ago by Freestyle Digital Media, and it's available on iTunes, Apple TV, Amazon, many other digital platforms, and it's also available on DVD on Amazon and many other, wherever you get your movies. And it's being distributed right now in North America and soon the Caribbean, and then hopefully all over the world after that.
I'll see you at the screening in Addis Ababa, Anna.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you. If you have any continental like deals or plans, do keep me posted. I'm an avid writer and producer, but I do have a niche which is very Pan-African. So everything about that excites me very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you very much.
My first podcast. Thank you so much.
And another one. Thanks again for tuning in to another episode of the Pan-African Film Podcast. We are now on Spotify and Instagram. Just search Pan-African Film Podcast to follow and like us there. Our new platform is 360 Africa. That's 360 Africa. And we want to thank our Kenyan Vibe partners. Shout out to the KV Squad. Last but not least, we thank our editor Ace. Please send us your feedback, like, follow, and comment.